Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Power BI DevCamp Session 15, Application Lifecycle Management in Power BI with Deployment Pipelines. My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a producer and video editor on the community team. I'm going to hand it over to Ted Pattison, our instructor for today. Ted, how's it going?
It's going very well. Ironically, we just had a tornado warning about 40 minutes ago, but I think that's all passed. I'm not in Kansas, I'm in Tampa, Florida, so how much danger could there be? Anyway, I always like to start a session with a little drama.
Sure.
But thank you very much. Welcome everyone for ALM in Power BI with Deployment Pipelines, quite a mouthful. And so what we're going to do is for about the next 60 minutes or so, just kind of go through some content slides and plenty of demos. And, we'll be monitoring the questions as they come in. So please feel free to add questions, text-based. And as we cut to session breaks, generally that's when we look at the questions. Okay, also note that just to call out that we do Power BI DevCamp sessions once a month. If you go to this URL, you'll find the portal that has, all the information about that, as a, for instance, let me kind of go back over here, go to Power BI DevCamp. And in this session, I'll reference a couple other sessions, but, we have basically, a little over a year's worth of history, so I'm able to kind of point to earlier sessions that we did. And as you go to these particular pages, what you're going to see is that, you could start the video. Also, code samples, are going to be available. And so for today's session, this is session number 15. We don't have the recording yet. That's what we're making right now. But the PowerPoint slides, the GitHub repo, that has the content. And there's also going to be one C# console application that I'm going to show. So if you follow these links inside here, you can see you can get to the things that we are going to be showing inside of this session. Okay, and so once again, there's going to be some artifacts. What are artifacts? We'll talk about that in the session. There's some PowerShell scripts and a C# application called Deployment Pipeline Automation. Okay, on to the show. So what we want to do is just kind of get started, with what is meant by a deployment pipeline. And before that, we're going to kind of start with a quick introduction of, kind of getting, our foundation on what do we mean by DevOps and continuous integration and continuous deployment. Okay, and then, after we kind of look at the deployment pipelines at a somewhat high level, we're going to look at each individual artifact in Power BI. There's one for regular reports, a couple different ones you can use for datasets, one for paginated reports. So just making sure we have, understanding of what our source files are going to look like. We're going to talk about how we publish artifacts to the Power BI service. Great. We're going to talk about configuring deployment rules, a really powerful part. And also, my first demo, I'm going to do everything by hand. My second demo, I'm going to run code that does the exact same thing. So whether you're fine just, configuring pipelines by hand, or you really kind of need to, roll them up into some automated fashion, we're going to cover the content here that's going to allow you to succeed in that. And then at the very end, we'll talk about, what we have over the next couple months planned to release, as far as functionality for deployment pipelines. Great stuff. Okay, so let's kind of start with a very abstract discussion. We're not quite getting to Power BI yet, but when people talk about DevOps, they talk about having a software development team working very closely with the IT operations team. And the idea is we don't want to package things and only once a year have devs go to the IT department and say, how do we get this into production? But to kind of streamline the process where we're constantly pushing out small updates. And we get so good at pushing out updates that doing it in very small increments, becomes just the way we do business. Now, you also have CI and CD. So what is continuous integration? Now, once again, we're not to Power BI yet. So let's say that we're building some type of an application. Maybe it's a .NET application or it's a Java application. Well, the idea is that we have a shared repository and everybody that's building source files, especially code that can be compiled, we all basically maintain it in a single place. And when 1 out of 100 programmers makes a change, we're able to rebuild the code of everybody, make sure it builds, and then also run it through automated testing. And that gets to be one of the things, that makes it today where you're seeing changes to just about all the services you use, quite often on a weekly basis. I remember going back a decade with things like SharePoint, where one version would come out and you'd learn everything, and then you'd have 3 months to rest on your laurels. And, basically when the industry turned to CI/CD, all that changed. Now, contiguous integration is really just about putting all the source code somewhere and making sure we have a build and test process so it's ready to ship. And then there's the CD part, the continuous delivery. Well, how do we take that application and push it out into a production environment? And are there DLLs and configuration information that have to be updated? So once again, whether you're doing, DevOps and CI/CD, for a web application with lots of code, or Power BI, one thing that's going to be very different is what are the things that you're really building, and what are the things that you then are staging to deploy to your production environment. Now, when it comes to Power BI, we don't have applications that have 100 C# files. We have a single PBIX file, or maybe 2 or 3 PBIX files. So one thing we have to kind of understand right off the bat is that the PBIX file is a black box to versioning systems. So if you have a PBIX file and it's a report and you push it into source code and that's version 1, and then you open the PBIX file back up in Power BI Desktop and add page 2, we want to take that PBIX file and keep saving it back to the repository. Because quite often we push out a version and then we realize, oops, what we did, didn't work so well. How do we get back to the previous version? And it's basically having, these artifacts. Now, one thing you have to choose is, where are you going to maintain all these Power BI artifacts? So GitHub and Azure DevOps, would be good places to store it if you were kind of taking on a professional ALM story. For companies that Azure DevOps might be, a little bit too much to bite off, certainly there are ways to use OneDrive and SharePoint and get versioning. Okay, so in this session, I'm not going to talk as much about the source control system, and when I do, I'll probably assume we're using Azure DevOps, but it's really about taking our things from source control and pushing it into Power BI, and we do that through import operations. Now, going one step further, now let's introduce deployment pipelines in Power BI. And the idea of a deployment pipeline is that we have these different artifacts. And I'm just going to use the term artifact in a very generic way. An artifact could be a data set definition, a report, a PBIX report, or a paginated report, could be a dashboard, could be a data flow. And the idea is you maintain the source files for these in Azure DevOps or GitHub or SharePoint. And then what we're going to do is we're going to import them, into a workspace. Now, the way that ALM works in Power BI is that we have this series of workspaces. So let's say I have my workspace that I intend to use as the dev workspace. I then create a deployment pipeline. So a deployment pipeline, think of it as this abstraction that takes 3 different workspaces. And the idea is that you'll have the dev workspace, you'll deploy assets that will push from the dev workspace to the test workspace, and then finally you'll do another deploy and push to the production workspace. Now it's hard-coded, into this feature that we have 3 stages. It's stage 0, stage 1, and stage 2 when we get more low level. And you could really think of this as, ALM and Power BI is really artifact lifecycle management more than it is application lifecycle management. And the whole idea is that with pipelines, you can push things into a dev workspace, make sure that they come up okay, push them into a test workspace, do all our testing, and then finally push to production. Now, just to see things in a little bit more detail, the dev stage workspace is something where you're going to import your assets inside there. Now, you could use GitHub and Azure DevOps and use professional ALM techniques or Azure DevOps extensions to push your source files into your dev workspace to create the actual objects, the data sets, the reports, and the dashboards. So the dev workspace is just where we push things in. Note that there is no underlying source code export import format for dashboards. So dashboards you would always have to kind of create once you've got the dev workspace up and going. But the idea is that then we have a test workspace. And with the test workspace, we're able to share the content with testers and reviewers, and run user experiences where we have, the same amount of data. If you have a large amount of data and your dev workspace and your devs in Power BI desktop just have little slivers of data, now we want to push into a space, where we can, test the true load of data. And then you have your production workspace. The idea is that once we do our testing in the test workspace and someone signs off that this is good to go, we're able to run a deploy operation and push those assets, into the production workspace. Now, in just a second, we're going to do a demo. But just at a high level, there's a couple really important things that I want to get across. Well, first of all, a workspace can only be in one pipeline. So internally, a workspace has a pipeline ID, and it either is in a workspace or it's not. But a workspace cannot be, in two pipelines. The other thing here is that once you create a pipeline, you can configure membership, for each workspace individually. So the same users that get to my dev workspace is not the same users that I want to be able to get to the test workspace, and or the production workspace. Also note that deployment pipelines brings in something called deployment rules. And the idea is that we can just keep looking at the dev database in the dev workspace, but once we push, into the test workspace, we want to have the data sets reconnect, to a different, more realistic database. And then finally, when we deploy to the production workspace, we want to look at the actual production data. And so deployment pipelines via these deployment rules can kind of take care of that configuration for us. Okay, so that brings us up to, let's go ahead and do our first demo. So what we're going to do for this first demo, let's go back to Power BI. And so step number one is let's create a new workspace. We'll create this new workspace. I'll just call this Acme Sales. And one thing to note here is that there's a diamond. So every single workspace has to be in a premium capacity. Okay, I'm with Microsoft. We keep changing the meaning of what premium capacity means. I'm sorry about that. But today, when we say premium capacity, we mean anything with a diamond. So behind this, you could have an A SKU capacity or a P SKU capacity or a premium per user capacity. It just can't be without the diamond, meaning it's in the shared capacity. So for companies that don't have premium capacities, this is a premium only feature. Okay, so now that we have that, I can create a pipeline from here. Also note, I can go to the Create Pipelines button. And so before I do that, let's go to our workspace. And inside of our workspace, Acme Sales. Okay, this is giving me a hard time. Come on, navigation. Let me get to Acme Sales. There we go. Okay, that's okay. I think I need to do a hard refresh because it keeps taking me to my workspace. Okay, finally, here we are at Acme Sales. Now, before I can do a deployment, I need at least one artifact. So what I'm going to do, and all the files I'm going to be using, are part of the files in the GitHub repo I pointed to earlier. So if you wanted to play around, with this, I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to do that. Okay, so now we have a data set and a report. So now let's go to deployment pipelines. Under deployment pipelines, what you can see down here is create a pipeline. And so let's say I just call this one Acme Sales. I'm going to go ahead and choose OK. And so now I've got my 3 stages, but we haven't assigned a workflow yet, a workspace. Keep your terminology tight, Ted. Okay, we have to assign a workspace. So note down here, there is a selection, of particular workspaces. And what it shows me is it has to be a V2 workspace. It has to be something I am the admin of. Okay, and it can't be a workspace that's in a different pipeline. So they're able to kind of show you all those that are candidates. Now, you're only going to assign one workspace. And the two common techniques would be to assign it to the dev workspace, and then we're going to push forward to create the other two. Or you could create it around the production workspace and push backwards. That's not as common. It is possible. But let's go ahead and assign. And so now what you're going to see is that, inside of the workspace for our development stage, we can see what are the assets that we have. So datasets, reports, dashboards. I'll call out that we support dataflows, but that support is preview support. I'll talk more about that, at the end of our session. But now what we're going to be able to do is do a deploy. And the very first time you run a deploy, it's going to create this other workspace. Now, if you click deploy to create the workspace, but you don't have any permissions to add a workspace into a capacity, it will fail. So there's a lot of things that you kind of have to keep in mind. Well, now we've gotten some changes down here. Let's go ahead and push one more time. And so kind of now we've pushed, all the way down here. You can kind of see that it uses this naming convention that whatever the first one was, it gives the second one names. And I don't like those names, so I'm going to go ahead and just go to Workspace Settings. And, inside of Workspace Settings, let's go ahead and call this one just Test. Let's go to this one right here. So once again, very easy to get to Workspace Settings. And let's say that this is production. We don't want to show what it is. We just want users. Now, there's an issue where this one is called, wingtip sales, and you can't give two different workspaces the same name because of the XMLA endpoint, basically, because it has to. But if I go and rename that to dev, now what I can do is I can come back here and go to Workspace Settings. So you can name these things whatever you want, but I think to me, this is the most natural, where the dev and the test have callouts, but Acme Sales, is just where we've deployed to. Now, you saw me do a push here. Great. So if I go back to the dev, and so what we initially had, was basically this workspace right here. And so if I open up this report, it should work, because we have content inside there. Okay, now the point I want to demonstrate is let's go from dev to test. Okay, and there's the dataset's there. There's the report. Let's open up the report, and I try to refresh the report, and I just get a whole bunch of X's. And, that is the way it's supposed to work. So the idea is that when it's copying the data set, it copies the metadata, but it doesn't copy the data. So in some cases, you might have to go to settings and configure credentials. I've set things up so I don't need to do that in my demo. I can just run a refresh and it will work. But the idea is that we don't copy the data, we just copy the metadata across, and once, we have done our first refresh, we should now be able to go here. We should be able to open that up, and now I might have cached data that, makes me go and click this refresh button, but now, we're connected to data. Yeah. And once again, if I go back to deployment pipelines and I open up this pipeline, we've got the same issue in production, where we have metadata only. And so notice that they give you kind of a quick way to do a refresh all from here. But once again, the pipeline does not run the refresh for you. That's your responsibility, after you've run one of the deployment operations to push things out. Okay, now a couple things I want to show, just because they're important. First of all, let's say that I wanted to give access away to someone. So let's say we came up here and, we have some user. Okay, we got this contractor, Jason Bourne, but note, I can add him, to the pipeline as a member, and there's only one member, admin. But we've also kind of created the experience, where if you wanted to, quickly, make him an admin here, and an admin here, and he doesn't really need to be an admin of production, but he needs to push content inside there, so we'll make him a member, and then we'll go ahead and click add. So once again, as you're working through this, just realize we have some kind of nice conveniences there. Okay, one other thing I want to show here, not only can you configure permissions, and you have to think about permissions both at the workspace level and the deployment pipeline level, but let's say that for deployment, we don't want development and test pointing to the same database. So I'm going to click on deployment settings, and notice that there's these things called deployment rules. And so for a data set, I can basically change a SQL connection string. In my case, I have a data set that's defined with parameters. So now I'm going to come back here. We're going to add a parameter. That one is fine, but now for the database name, I'm going to go ahead and switch that, from my dev database to my production. And here, it's important I kind of show you the sequence, and the sequence that we have here is that now if I look at my assets and I say compare, I can see this one's out of sync. And so basically, because there's a deployment rule, you're going to have to run this deployment. So, let's say that I come here, and you can either deploy everything or you can deploy one or more things at a time with a selective deploy. Well, let's go ahead and run that right here. And so just to harp on, it doesn't refresh for you. You need to refresh yourself. Didn't mean for that to happen. Deployment failed. Let's see if I can run that one more time. And let's see if we can get that ugly error to go away. Very good. Okay, so we pushed the changes over. But what I want you to see here, once again, if I go and open this thing up, it's still pointing to my dev database. Okay, and I'll do a refresh just to prove it. Yep, still pointing to the dev database. So now that I've changed the deployment rule, for tests, so this reconnects, I'm going to have to run, one more refresh operation. So let's let this refresh operation run right here. And once this refresh operation runs, I should be able to open up this report, refresh it, and see that, it no longer points, to that's the old database. But if I come back up here and I do a refresh, okay, so now we've truly got, test and dev pointing to different databases, because of this particular rule. And then, the way things are going to work is that you're either going to push new things, into dev right here, or you're going to make changes. Let's say that I come back up here, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new dashboard, and we'll create this new dashboard, and I'll call it, sales perf. And the idea is that once we've created this new dashboard, and if I come here, let's kind of take a look at the dashboard. Oh, sorry, wrong one. One more time. So here's the dashboard, inside of my dev site. Let's go back to pipelines. And, what we should see, as we, do this comparison here, is that somehow it wasn't picking up that change. And dashboards. And okay, why is it not picking up my change there? Because I'm going to the wrong place. Okay, Ted's already screwed up the demo. But if I come back here, okay, here is what I meant to do. Give me one more chance. I promise I won't screw it up. Okay, so one more time, we'll go back to the dev site, and we'll create a new dashboard. And this one is sales perf. And the idea is that, now that I have done that, we should now be able to go back to our pipeline and see, there is something, inside of our development environment, that's not over here. Let's go ahead and choose this and deploy this. And what's kind of neat is that, after we've done that deploy, let's go back, and let's look at sales perf. But my question is, what underlying database is this going to be looking at? And so we're going to open this up, and what we should see is that as we move the dashboard, because our data set automatically redirects, so do all my reports and all the dashboards on top. Okay, so with that demo, I wanted to kind of show quite a few things which I think are the first things to learn. And so I'm going to go through these next couple slides pretty quickly just because the demo kind of showed. But inside the UI, if you are the admin of the site and you have premium capacities, you're going to see deployment pipelines. But there are things where if you're not an admin of everything and you have no ability to, add a workspace to a capacity, for most end users, all the deployment pipeline links, will be hidden from those users. Now, I showed you how to assign a workspace, and we saw this list of workspaces. And once again, only one workspace can be assigned to a pipeline. And the common thing is to assign the dev and then to do a deployment push and another deployment push to create the two others. It is also possible to assign to the production. Let's say you've had a workspace, which is your production workspace. You didn't even use deployment pipelines. But what you could do is you could assign that as the production, and there is a way to deploy backwards, not in an ongoing fashion, but for the initial deploys. Okay, so once again, when you deploy to an empty stage, what happens is it first creates the workspace. And if you don't have permissions to create workspaces or to add workspaces into a premium capacity or no capacity is available, this cannot succeed, it will fail. And then it clones all the content. And the same thing happens as we push out to production. And then once you've done that initial deploy where you're creating the workspaces, additional deployments, simply look at things that have changed and push the changes there. Now, what attributes are copied, as we deploy from stage to stage? So things that you do in reports, report page layouts, report visuals, dashboard tiles, the data set definition, things like the DAX code for the measures you write, RLS role definitions, but not RLS role assignments. So a lot of this kind of falls into it's part of a definition, not data associated with an instance category. Things we've recently added support is auto aggregations and the incremental refresh policy. Sensitivity labels have a couple special rules, and that is if we have one in dev, and there's none in test, we'll write it there, and likewise from test. If there's one that's there but is more severe, we don't overwrite. We'll overwrite to make it more severe, but we'll never kind of lower a sensitivity label in a deployment. Now, there are the things that don't get copied at all, namely the data. But what you'll see is that artifacts, in each of the three workspaces have their own GUIDs for reports and data sets. They'll have their own URLs. Workspace permissions and workspace settings are completely independent. Also note that, let's go back, into my pipeline, and note that if I drop this, down inside here, or now here's the link, you can publish this as an app. So any of these workspaces can be published as an app. That way you have an app that you can look with your test workspace, and you can test it in the app before you push it to production inside. Just like refreshing, deployment pipelines are never going to publish the app or update the app. You have to do that either manually or through some automated fashion. And we'll talk about that, in just a little bit. But some of the other things, refresh schedules don't get copied. And you can imagine that the refresh schedule, you might not even need in the test environment, because every time you push things across, you might want to do a refresh right then. But if you don't test for 3 weeks, you don't want to keep refreshing the data. We definitely want to keep refreshing the data in production. Also RLS role assignment, is done on a workspace by workspace basis. And also for incremental refresh, partitioning is done individually. And then there's copy with rules. And we saw there's copy with rules for the data source, behind a report, or if you have parameters, what we're going to see is copy with rules will also work for paginated reports and for data flows. And we'll see that coming up in a couple slides. Now, remember that the permissions model starts with who can access this pipeline. So we go back to the pipeline, and you're either a member or you're not. Since there's only one role, let's make it feel important. So we'll call it admin. But the idea is, if I make you an admin, you can view the pipeline, you can share it with others, you can edit and delete the pipeline. If you have pipeline access, can you add a workspace? Maybe, but you have to have other workspace memberships. So you have to be at least a member if you want to view workspace content. If you want to compare stages, you have to be a member in both. If you want to deploy reports, you have to have, member, or admin access as well. Or if you want to update data sets. Now, in order to add or remove a workspace, from the pipeline, you have to be the workspace admin. And then finally, there's something where if you and I are admins, but I'm the data set owner, I can configure rules, but you can't. You can take over the data set and then configure the rules, but still, we have a restriction where only the data set owner can be the one that configured roles. And you saw me do that, in my demo. And you also saw this dialog that makes it easier for you to kind of quickly configure permissions, to the pipeline and all the relevant workspaces for that pipeline at the same time. Okay, great stuff. Now, in our next section, I might start sounding like a certified public accountant. I'm going to go through a lot of details about Power BI artifacts, but it's important to kind of know these as you create your versioning scheme.
So what are the different questions, Ted?
Okay, you got some questions there. Okay, yeah. I can go over and look at the.
Just one from Jimmy about our company uses Power BI Pro, and I don't see the premium capacity diamond icon next to the workspace name. What can we do?
Unfortunately, for you, unfortunately for Microsoft, the only way you're going to be able to do that, is by buying a SKU that gives you a premium capacity. There are EM SKUs that start a lot cheaper, but if all you have is Power BI Pro and no capacity licensing, unfortunately, this is just not a feature that's available. You'd have to, create some kind of scheme just by writing code against the Power BI, REST API to do the equivalent. So it's kind of a premium feature, so you don't have to write code. You could look at it that way. Okay. Okay, does the Power BI usage metrics out of the box deployed from dev to test workspace using pipelines? No, I don't believe that does, but that's something I don't believe that pipelines are used. Pipelines are only used by companies that choose to use them. The Power BI team doesn't use it as a mechanism to push any content out. Now, here's the quick list of artifacts. There is dataset, which is the very common PBX file with Power BI Desktop. You can use BIM files. Reports are always in PBX files. If you have a paginated report, it's going to be in an RDL file. Data flows, you can create them in the browser in the Power BI service, but then you can export them to a JSON file, and you can obviously manipulate the JSON inside there if you're capable, or if you're able to work without the visual editor. And then finally, remember, dashboards really have no file format. So dashboards you just have to create inside of the dev workspace and push them forward. Now, once you've seen this right here, let's kind of go through a couple more things. So what a lot of people do is they create standalone PBX files. And the idea is you have both a report layout and a dataset definition in one PBX file. And that gets to be a very simple way, because either by hand or through PowerShell or through the API, we can push them in. But remember, a single PBX file does not allow multiple authors to use it at the same point. So often we see companies that are trying to get ALM and they have one team that's working with the data set, another team working with the report. And then these emails saying, are you done with the PBX file? You said you're going to be done at noon. It's 3 o'clock. We're all waiting. So they can't start editing the PBX file until the other team finishes. So one strategy that gets to be common, is to basically create PBX files, that are intended to be data set only. And the example we have in these demo files are our product sales model. And then you could do something such as push out the data set. And then you can open up Power BI Desktop and say connect to a data set. So basically you start creating other very small PBX files, that are kind of like satellite PBX files. They just connect to a data set, with Live Connect. And that now gives you the opportunity, to have one data set author and 3 different report authors all be independent of one another, being able to push out changes and roll things back. Another thing is, imagine we push out a change to the report. We're working with a single PBX file, and then we push out a change to the data set, and then we push out another change to the report, and then we decide that's no good. We roll back to the earlier report operation, but we just roll back my data set. I just rolled back and got rid of the measures I put inside there. So once again, kind of going to a multi-versioning scheme just gives you a lot more capabilities, to kind of overcome kind of the bottleneck that is a single PBX file that doesn't support multiple, authors at one time. Okay, now also we recommend when you create data sets, create them with parameters. So you can have a parameter that points to the database server or database name, like I did in my demo. You could have other data set parameters that affect things like where clauses. But the idea is that if you use data set parameters, you have a lot of control because it's very easy to change those parameters, as you go through the different deployment stages with deployment rules. Another thing you could do is, there are some developers, that once you have a, Power BI desktop file, let's say that, I come back here, I start up Power BI desktop, and I can open a particular project with with the Tabular Editor. Okay, and once this opens, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Tabular Editor. And so the Tabular Editor is a third-party tool. Lots of information you can, and blogs you can find about it. But let's say that I have this particular report that I would like to open up. And so if I go here, and I go to my artifacts, and here's customer sales. And what you can see is that if you have installed Power BI or the Tabular Editor on your machine, you should be able to open this up with a Tabular Editor. And the idea is you have this whole new level of possible data model capabilities that we have inside here. But if you're going to go down this road, note that I can then do a save as and save this as a BIM file. And then you don't continue to edit your data sets with Power BI Desktop, you edit them with Tabular Editor. So once again, a lot of companies don't like this technique because they like Power BI Desktop. It's something we know. It's not this tool that's third party, but for companies that really aren't afraid of that kind of developer level and would rather kind of maintain data set definitions in JSON files, one of the neat things is, look what I can do in Azure DevOps. What's the difference between version 14 and version 15 of our data set? Oh, we added those 3 measures, or we changed format strings. So just having text-based source files as opposed to a PBX, can have some value. Okay. Also note, we support paginated reports, which are RDL files, and one of the big motivations people have to use paginated reports in Power BI is they give you a lot more control over the printed page, or more likely exports to PDF. And I want to have page headers and footers and things like that. So those can be maintained in an RDL file and used in the exact same strategies we're talking about here. And finally, data flows. Remember, the data flows support for deployment pipelines is in preview. But if you take a data flow and export it as a JSON file, you can then track that in source code, and you can go ahead and deploy that as well. Now, I want to get to the last section. So purposely, I'm going to go through, I'm not sure if there's questions, Dana, but I think for time, let me get to these next two sections and I can answer some questions before we get to the API section.
Sounds good.
Okay, but one of the things, let's say that one of you is deploying your artifacts, maintaining them in Azure DevOps, another in GitHub, another in SharePoint. We have to be able to take those artifacts and import them into the Dev Workspace. So that can be done using PowerShell, using the Microsoft Power BI management commandlets. You can do it by calling the Power BI REST API directly. If you don't support .NET, typically you just kind of work in whatever language and platform to submit HTTP requests and get back results. But if you're using .NET or .NET Core, you can use the Power BI .NET SDK, which really increases your productivity. If you're using something like Azure DevOps, there are quite a few extensions. The most popular one I see used is the Power BI Actions. And what are the types of operations? So when we write code to automate ALM for Power BI, quite often I need to create a workspace, assign a workspace to a dedicated capacity, import a PBX file, update data source parameters or connection strings, patch credentials, start refresh operations. Now, I'm not going to cover those here, but instead I'm going to point to a couple sessions. So there's a session from last October where I gave kind of an intro to using PowerShell scripts, and this will show you how to upload PBX files and patch SQL credentials. Also, last April or May, I had an advanced dataset programming. So this is both the video and lots of sample code. If you need the code that's going to upload things. And then finally, I want to kind of point out that there are several Azure DevOps extensions. There's one called Power BI Actions, and the idea is that they kind of have pre-written code that's easy to configure in an Azure DevOps pipeline to do things like import and patch credentials. Another one that I've seen, and this one actually adds some new extensions for pipelines, is the Macaw Power BI extension. So if you're using Azure DevOps, you might look at both of those. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a demo where we're just using C# running on my machine. So hopefully this is C# code that you could then abstract to, wherever you want to run it. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start up my friend Fiddler. And so I'm going to run demo 1. And what you're going to see is that when I run this code right here, I'm confusing myself. What this is going to do is it is going to, and now let's get back over to our friend Fiddler here. It is going to call the Power BI REST API to do a whole bunch of operations. Okay, so we're not going to cover how to do this. I've done it in other sessions. The sample code that you see running, is yours to look through just to get the detail. But what we're going to see, is after I run this code for demo 1, let's go back here. And now what I should have done, is created this Contoso sales dev. So at this point, we haven't done anything other than run API code to create a new workspace and fill it with our content. But now we have things like the data sets are pointed to the right data set. We have credentials patched so we can run refresh operations as well. So now we get to the point where we want to create a pipeline. But earlier I showed how to do that by hand. And just to kind of prove that this can be done via code as well, let's go back here. And so, now what we're going to do is we're going to run code, which is actually going to, do the pipeline operations. Okay, if I come back here and we kind of look, what we can see is, we've created a pipeline with a patch request. I should also be able to go here. And what's kind of neat about this is that our UI, is kind of aware. So here's the pipeline I just created by hand. You can see that currently we are running the first deploy operation, which is kind of automating creating this test notice that I get complete control if I automate it, what the names of this are, once we've done this deploy inside here. And then, also remember, that it doesn't automatically refresh. However, if I go here, and I, open this up right here, what we should see is that if you run code to run the deploy operation, you can also run code to do the refresh inside there. Okay, now one of the things that we can't do via code yet is to configure deployment rules. So if I come back over here, now we have deployment rules. Let me go a couple more slides here. So now what you kind of saw there was I, first of all, started with a C# application that just uses the Power BI REST API to push all the assets into the dev site and get things ready. Okay, now what we're going to see is that I showed deployment settings before, but now it's going to be a little bit better because we have a data flow, we have 2 different data sets, and we have paginated reports. Okay, also remember that today we don't support an API, so these have to be configured by hand. That's the bad news. The good news is generally you only have to do it once, within the lifetime. It's not an ongoing thing that you have to do. But if I have a paginated report, notice that that doesn't really have a Power BI data set. It has its own data source, but for every named data source, I can see what it is and I can say, no, I want to set that to something different. So there's, changing, that for a paginated report. Same thing if I come back here and I go to data flows. A data flow, if I define my data flow with parameters, which is what I'd recommend, you can do the same thing with parameter rules, or, if you just kind of have raw database connection strings, as long as you're using one of the supported types of databases, you can add data source rules just to kind of change the connection string inside there. Okay, so once again, what I wanted to kind of step through there, was just how we have deployment settings, and then you're able to add, basically deployment rules for anything that points to a data source. So that includes, the adding it for data sets. So remember with data sets, you can use parameters or not. Also, same thing for paginated reports, except they don't support parameters, but they support a way for you to examine each named data source and change the connect to information inside there. Note that for Power BI datasets, you have to run a refresh afterwards. For paginated reports that point right to the SQL database, there's no refresh, because it's basically pulling from the database in real time. And then also, note that we have deployment rules inside there. Okay, and once again, as you're writing code, doing refresh operations, quite often mandatory. So, make sure that you're, you're doing that as well. Okay, let's see. Do we have questions? This might be another good time if there's a set of questions here.
Oh yeah, we have a few. I would say I got one here that says, would it be sufficient just to purchase one Power BI premium license to try out deployment pipeline feature while keeping the rest of Power BI Pro licenses as is in our company?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have a Power BI premium license. If you get a P1, it's $5,000 a month. So you don't casually, and you buy it at a month at a time. It would be possible if you work with Azure to create the Power BI embedded service just to test. Or the other thing that you could do is just use Power BI premium per user. And that's something where you can just bump users up to, from 10 to 20 bucks a month. But realize that, if you go to Power BI premium per user, so you can use deployment pipelines, anyone that goes to any of those workspaces needs the Power BI per user. So it's just really not a Power BI Pro feature. Okay, why don't we take one more question before I get on to the last section here?
Sure, I got a long one from Anonymous here. When deploying a report from from say dev to test, and you have lots of reports, data sets, etc., it can be hard to find that one report data set you want to deploy when you have 50 plus items. Are there plans to introduce a filter in the deployment pipeline to make it easier to find the report you want?
No, well, I don't know of any plans to add any kind of filtering into the UI. If you were writing PowerShell or you were writing, your own code to automate the deployment, that would be simple to do. But I think you're talking about through the UI that's just part of that. And, I don't think we have any plans to do that. And, I kind of hear your point, and I think your point is that if I can get back to the browser here, I'll get there sooner or later. There it is up here. So I think what you're saying is, what if I have, 100 things down there, and I will take your feedback and pass that along if that's a pain point for you. But like I said, I have no immediate knowledge of that we have plans or have gotten enough feedback where we're acting on that. Okay. Tell you what, let me go ahead. And I think it's great to do questions. I don't think we have to, I can do questions past the end of the hour. I want to end the content by the end of the hour. So let me go back here to my slides. And so what I now want to kind of do is talk about using APIs to create and manage deployment pipelines. So if you want to kind of see, how I've done this, note that inside of this sample app, deployment pipeline automation, the Power BI pipeline manager, is where I put most of this code here. Note that you'll have to put in your capacity ID, so that's the GUID to your PSKU. Also note that if you open up, app.config, there are special settings you'll need to put inside here. You'll need to fill out the public application ID if you're going to run as a user, or the confidential if you're going to run, as a service principal. But what I want to now kind of show is that if I go down and I do something like get pipeline, so note there's just a pipelines. Now, for you to be able to get the pipelines, you have to run as admin. There is a get pipeline where you don't have to be an admin, you just have to be a member of the pipeline. But here's what I'm using just to enumerate through the pipelines and find the one that I want. Also, here is the deploy to pipeline stage. And ultimately, we're going to call, down here, you can kind of see that we have this call to pipelines deploy all. So there is a deploy all and a deploy selective. Deploy all means deploy anything that's changed. And there's also a deploy selected. Now, here is a deploy all request. So you need a stage. And once again, the stage is an integer, 0 for dev, 1 for test, 2 for production. There are the deployment options. Do you want to overwrite artifacts? Typically, yes. If you need to take over ownership, a crowd artifact, there's also this idea of purging data. And one of the things to note is if you have a data set and you push it from one stage to another, quite often we just push the metadata, but the underlying rows stay the same. But that only works as long as the data set definition in its queries doesn't add more columns or change things. So you might have to say allow purge data, and the idea is that it's going to throw the rows of data away because they're no good, because I'm pushing over a new data set and the query adds 3 new columns, that won't be there in the old data rows. Now, if it is a first deploy, what you can see is that there is this deploy all request. And so there is a new workspace property. And so here, we're going to give it the name, so here's kind of how I wrote the code, such that if I'm pushing out here, I'm going to call it Contoso Sales Test, but you get to come up with a name. And then also very important, you have to specify the capacity ID, of how you're connecting it, and kind of putting the diamond in place. And then we have a deploy all. Okay. If I go back here, just a couple more slides, I just kind of walk through this code right here. Note that there's also the ability, if you'd rather do it in PowerShell and not write C# against the Power BI REST API and the Power BI .NET SDK, like my last sample had, So once again, everything is also available to you using PowerShell. Once again, before we end, I just want to go back to our GitHub repo. And, if we look at this session right here, here's the code, the C# application, but if you look at PowerShell right here, here's just a couple PowerShell scripts that I wrote, that will do things like, get you the pipeline artifacts, operations, deploy. So once again, I kind of wanted you to be able to use those resources. Okay. Note that if you're using Azure DevOps, you've had to kind of rely on third-party extensions written by people in the community, and we're very happy that they did that. But now we have a native ADO, Azure DevOps extension, and we're going to add operations for Azure DevOps pipelines for create new workspace, assign workspace to pipeline, so add user to pipeline, deploy to pipeline test stage. So once again, if you're using Azure DevOps, we're going into a public preview over the next few months. So once again, I would think by the end of the year, we'll have something in preview that you can test out. Okay. Just the last slide to wrap up, what are things to look forward to? And that is first what I just mentioned, the Azure DevOps native extension for the pipeline APIs. Okay, also what we're planning for January of next year is to have our dataflow support and deployment pipelines go GA. So in preview, we haven't supported linked entities or multiple authors, editing a data flow at one time, but we will be adding, that support for GA. There's also deployment history. So what we're working towards is being able to create, a effective log so you can go and look at the deployment history. And, when did this change get pushed out? It was pushed out on October 12th by this guy named Ted Pattison. So those are the things that we're trying to do. And then the last thing is getting multiple pipelines to work together. So this one we're planning for March 2022. But, here's the issue today. Let's say that you have one set of workspaces for your data sets and another set of workspaces for reports. And so if they're in different pipelines, they don't recognize each other. And so when you connect a report to a data set that doesn't live in the pipeline, it stays the same as you push from, one space to another. And so what that means is you can't really, use multiple pipelines in the way that many of our customers have said, we'd really like to use them this way. So the work that we're going to do, is basically to have multiple pipelines working together, such that when your report connects to an external, to a workspace that's not in our pipeline, it recognizes, oh, but it's in a different pipeline and it's connected to stage 0 in that pipeline. So as we push things through, we're going to be able to kind of keep the coordination. And from the feedback that we've gotten, here's what a lot of companies, really want. This idea that they will have one pipeline for all their data sets that will be used as shared data sets. And then we can have one or more pipelines, for our report authors. So hopefully early in the year, we should have a public preview on this. But just wanted to make sure that you knew, that this was in our plans. So with that, we're now kind of on to the question slide, Daniel.
Fantastic, Ted.
I can kind of see the questions if you can kind of queue up which one I should answer.
Yeah, so probably the one that says, before you have showed how to change the pointing for the data source for the other environment. Is there a way to automate the process?
Okay, so I think to specifically what your question is do you support an API to configure deployment rules? And unfortunately, the answer is no, we do not. I think that's the one major piece that we have a gap that we need to, get that API fixed. But, currently today, data set setting, or I'm sorry, deployment settings and deployment rules have to be configured by hand.
Another question is regarding that same point. Another question is, now you are clicking on the respective button for deploying from one environment to another. There is a queue. That's all I'm seeing. Does that question make sense to you?
No, it seems like that Monty Python skit where the cartoonist kind of died as the screen was going on.
Yeah, we can go to the next one. Is it possible
Feel free to resubmit. Okay, so is it possible to do reverse migration using deployment pipelines, or do we need to go to the workspace and revert a change? In general, you don't want to make any updates, to test, and to, and I actually did a mistake earlier, kind of illustrating. If I was a good enough teacher, I'd tell you I did that on purpose to show you, what not to do. But I think if we go to pipelines here, and then we go to, the Acme sales pipeline, and now I put something here, that isn't back over here. So basically, what you can do is you can assign the first workspace to production and then deploy backwards, but that's a one-time thing. Other than that, you have to kind of put things in deployment and push them forward. And if you're not doing that, you're kind of going against the grain. So if you just add something, into production, we don't do anything with it. We just leave it alone. We're not going to overwrite it. But once again, you don't want to do that on purpose. I am sure many of us will do it, not on purpose, but it just happened, and now production can't get rid of it. So once again, the deployment pipeline is, if there's something, downstream and it's not upstream, it just gets ignored. Okay.
Right. I think we have one more question. Time for one more question.
Will there be any future functionality to deploy a report to multiple workspaces? We have some reports that are centralized. So deployment pipelines will not do that for you. But I could see you adding something, to the effect of, you could go to the production site. Now, this is using code, but then there are Power BI REST methods to take a report and just copy its content. So like in Power BI's embedding scenarios, we have an update to a report, but now we have that report spread out across 100 different tenant workspaces. So writing a code to enumerate through and just kind of do the, operation to update content, for that report can be enumerated through there. But if you're not going to, tackle that, through PowerShell or code, I'm not sure, how you would get that. It's not going to be a feature that's built into deployment pipelines.
Okay. Well, Ted, I just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you, especially Ted, for teaching us a little bit about application lifecycle management in Power BI with deployment pipelines. I wanted to get a quick plug-in for the Power BI community at community.powerbi.com, as well as check out our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find past DevCamp sessions, as well as loads of other Power BI content there. Ted, thank you so much for your always informative sessions, and I will see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you for your directorial skills. You are the Martin Scorsese of webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, have a good one.